Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. We have a great program, I think, really informative about the need for public banks here in New York State and some of the great work that can be done with public banks. And the Senator will be the host tonight. And over to you, Senator.
I am very grateful to be the chair of banking for New York State at the Senate level. I am very grateful that my chair at the Assembly level is also here, Assemblyman Prachado, who is going to be a great chair of banking. And when I finish, I would love for him to, of course, have a word or two. I'm among friends, Ellen Brown, McRae. These folk are actually people who trained me in this so many moons ago. And we never thought the day would come when we would be this close in New York State, the capital of banking. If the banking world has a capital, it is in New York City. And we are the Empire State. Never has the world needed a public bank more than it needs it now. We have just gone through two pandemics, the immediate one of COVID-19 and the longer term one of racial and economic inequalities. Both of these things call out for a new way of looking at money, a new way of looking at how do we use the people's money to do the people's good. Now, we're going to hear a lot of that this evening, and we have some of the greatest people on here. The president of the Public Bank of North Dakota is here. It's a joy to speak to you again, sir. You and your bank have inspired so many. Whether we speak about the market meltdown of 2008, which you guys did not suffer, or we speak of the PPP fiasco, which you guys did not suffer. Now that's saying something, and we should learn from that. But greater minds than mine are going to speak on this, and I'm going to hand it to my colleague, our Assemblyman, our new chair of banking, Assemblyman Prachado. Please, sir, if you'll say a few words.
First of all, again, Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for those incredibly kind words. And I always look at these things as addition by subtraction, so I will be as brief as possible. Again, my name is Assemblymember Fdic Pichardo. I have the honor of representing my neighbors in the West Bronx, and the speaker nominated me to be the new chair of the Committee on Banks in the State Assembly, as Senator Sanders alluded to. And I look forward to working with him and leaning on his leadership in this particularly in this space, and learning more about this issue. And I'm looking forward to hearing, particularly from Mr. Hardmeyer and many people who are experts in this space, to understand how can it work here in the state of New York, how can it benefit my constituents, how can it benefit my neighbors, and how can we potentially move this economy forward and rethink how this economy can work in a post-COVID world here in New York State.
I was going to draw attention that we have the Senator Bridgeport on, but I do want to hear from Councilmember Carnegie, who is playing an important role in New York City. Sir, if you'd say a few words.
Thank you so much, Chair, and thank you, Senator. Thank you, Jabari. I see my senator is in the building, which is always good. If we're talking about banking, I like to make sure that my whole collective is here. So I got my senator in the building. Listen, on the city level, I think it's incredibly important. Well, first of all, at this particular time, when we're talking about recovery and resiliency, there's no better time to be talking about public banks than right now. More money is going to be spent on recovery and resiliency than probably in this city's history. More millionaires are going to be made. It's just an incredibly important time to be having this discussion. So when we think about leaving out those that have been left out through this banking institutions for so long, this is the right time to be inclusive, to be looking at a model that could work not only for housing co-ops, which really have the most difficulty getting financing, from traditional banks or worker co-ops, which we're working to make sure that these collective of workers now have an opportunity to go and get financing. I think we can use public banks in all of those instances. So it is great to be on with so many of my esteemed state colleagues to begin to tackle this issue and to reimagine banking in the city during this critical time. So thank you for inviting me to this conversation.
And what is your title, sir?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm the council member that represents Bed-Stuy and Crown Heights. I chair the Democratic Conference. I chair the MWBE Commission. I'm on finance, leadership. What else am I on? Everything that has to do with money, I'm a part of it. So thank you for allowing me to reintroduce myself, Senator. But those are the titles that I hold, representing a community that probably has one of the largest unbanked populations in the city of New York.
Well put, sir. Well put. I thank you for that.
So I just want to acknowledge briefly, State Senator Jabari Brisport has also joined us, and we thank him for coming on tonight. And I have Dr. Amara Enya, who will introduce our citizen presenters and lead us through the next part of the program.
Thank you so much. I want to definitely thank Senator Sanders for being here, as well as everyone who is joining us for this town hall, the Public Banking Institute for the tireless work that they've been doing on this issue for years, and for this moment that we're in that's really exciting because of the opportunities that it involves for really transformative change in our economy, much needed change, especially in light of everything that's happening with the pandemic and what a vision looks like for rebuilding our communities moving forward. So I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to co-moderate with the great senator and our distinguished guests. We have a presentation that will actually just do a little bit of background for everyone so that people who are tuned in can really understand what we mean when we're talking about a public bank and just get some foundational information. That presentation will be done by Victoria Alexander and Joseph Slackman and Madeline Chang. So they'll be doing this presentation, and then we'll launch into our conversation with President Hardmeyer of the Bank of North Dakota. So with that said, also I'm representing the Public Banking Institute as part of the advisory board for the Public Banking Institute. So it's a pleasure to be here. That said, I'd like to hand it over to our presenters for the slide presentation.
Hi, I'm Victoria Alexander from Dutchess County. I was a 2020 candidate for Congress, and I'm also Secretary of Ranked Choice New York and the Secretary of the Dutchess County Libertarian Party. And I just need to make my screen. Okay, I lost my notes. There we go. Slide 1, here we go. Bring on the power of public banking for New York. In this short presentation, we will first go over the problems that result from or can't be solved by private banking. And then we'll look at the solutions provided by public banking. We'll give a very brief history of some examples of public banking in the US, and then we'll end by imagining a better future for New York with a state bank. Slide 2, New York State is in trouble. Unemployment, business closings, increasing costs. Even before COVID, New York was in debt with high taxes, cutbacks in services, crumbling infrastructure, a shrinking population, and a pension obligation that we may not be able to meet. But this motivates us to change the way we've been financing projects using our tax money so that we can be more economically stable going forward and better able to handle the hard times. With 2020 hindsight, it's clear now that it's been a mistake to centralize and consolidate economic power. Since 2008, the US money stock has increased from about $7.5 trillion to over 19 trillion, with the steepest increase occurring since this March. But that money is not circulating around Main Street, where it could actually be used as a tool to increase production and services, to increase the wealth, health, and happiness of all New Yorkers. Our current banking system is not working for us. Next slide, please.
Huh? Sure.
Where do we find the money to start a bank?
What I'm doing. to
We've
talk to
lost
myself.
revenue during the economic crisis
All right.
caused by the lockdown. There are no CARES Act funds to make up for the revenue shortfalls. The state can even get cheap loans from the Federal Reserve, while the big banks and big corporations can. I'm afraid New York State will be forced to sell off some assets to private entities to avoid bankruptcy. But think about it, if private entities want to buy public utilities, that should indicate to us how valuable they are. A state bank can help us avoid privatization. We can hold on to our valuable public assets and make them work for us. Next slide. Banks don't have the problems that states have. Commercial banks can simply create the funds they want to lend for a profit, and they aren't under any obligation to look after the public good. That's an incredible amount of power that they have, and it has helped create the terrible economic disparity in the US and in New York. The US Treasury has been buying up the bad assets of the commercial banks. The banks keep the profits and socialize the losses. Under new 2020 rules, for-profit banks can borrow at the Fed's discount window at 0.25%. It's practically free. And they can turn around and charge struggling New Yorkers as much as 21% credit card interest. The Federal Reserve is loaning cheap money to the big commercial banks like crazy now that the requirement to keep 10% of funds on reserve has been eliminated. But as we said, that money's not going to Main Street. Clearly, this banking system is not set up to deal with a public crisis. It's the state that really needs cheap or free loans to get us out of this mess before irrevocable damage is done. Next slide. So we've defined some of the problems. Let's talk about solutions. Next slide. What is a public bank? Well, it's owned by the citizens, and a public bank must serve the public good. For example, in the little hamlet where I live in the Harlem Valley region, we don't have a public wastewater system, which means that we can't have many restaurants or a hair salon or a gym in town, which would attract other retail, which would attract more residents and get more tax revenue. Like many small towns and neighborhoods in big cities throughout the state, it's a little like a ghost town with beautiful old buildings going unused. I've served on the local wastewater committee. We have a high water table, rocky soil, many other constraints, which make a traditional sewer system very expensive. We paid for a number of feasibility studies, which tell us the obvious. Some businesses have already paid the tremendous expense of putting in on-site private systems, and they don't need or want a centralized system. It's been suggested that instead we could implement a much cheaper modular methane digesting system and work with local dairy farms to take their wastes. But loans for customized, non-traditional solutions are automatically considered risky. A wastewater system like this would be a win-win. The hamlet would attract business, we could help farmers and keep some of the dangerous methane from entering the atmosphere by using it to heat the town hall. Any wastewater system would eventually pay for itself, but the upfront costs are too much for our overtaxed citizens. And this is the same story throughout the state for all different kinds of infrastructure needs. A state bank could loan my hamlet the money at low interest, perhaps 1%. But commercial banks prefer to lend to those who don't really need the money. They tend to be biased against loaning to poor communities and minority neighborhoods, even though it's these communities that would make the most productive use of capital. Where does the money come from to fund a state bank? A public bank would hold the deposits of government like taxes and fees instead of putting that money in an account at a commercial bank. How much money does New York State currently have in commercial accounts? Consider every town, city, various government departments and agencies, even the state university system, which is the state's largest employer. Billions of dollars, I'd guess. Currently, these commercial banks are using a lot of that money to make low interest loans to multinational corporations or corporations outside the state. Meanwhile, these commercial banks use our money to make higher interest loans to our citizens, our businesses, and our cities. The state of New York has a lot of money that could be working for New York. Next slide, please. 25% of banks worldwide are publicly owned. I didn't know that earlier. This is not a new idea to think of banking as a public utility. China's bank creates the funds to build public infrastructure, and China is very infrastructure rich. But the US does not necessarily need to follow the specific examples of other countries. Our American vision would be banking for the people, by the people, local decision making. A state Bank of New York would be the opposite of the Great Reset solution that is being offered now, which would give even greater centralized control over credit creation. Next slide, please. Germany has a public bank network, a whopping 40% share of total banking assets. KfW is Germany's development bank, founded for Reconstruction after the war. Germany's public banks have a directive to make loans to local businesses. Consequently, they have a strong small and mid-sized business economy. They have a strong export economy too, not because they have Fortune 500 corporations, but because they have many, many small businesses that make things to export. Economic diversity is more stable and robust, and I want that for New York State. Also, Germany handled the economic hardships associated with the lockdown much better than countries without a strong public bank network. Germany's COVID program was much simpler to navigate than ours. Also, our funds disappeared quickly, grabbed up by big companies. Our private banks are not in the business of serving the public good, it's just not their mission. In handling the PPP loans, they defaulted to their usual practice of serving big companies. Next slide. In 2018, the American Samoa Public Bank was chartered. California has passed legislation to allow a Los Angeles public bank to go forward. Currently, the US has one public bank. The Bank of North Dakota has been around for 100 years. It weathered the 2008 credit crisis just fine. North Dakota was the only state to avoid budget shortfalls. North Dakota had the nation's lowest unemployment rate and default rate. North Dakota has the most locally owned banks per capita. The Bank of North Dakota provides access to capital for small community banks, who in turn loan to businesses and people in the community. Next slide. Let's compare the return on equity of the Bank of North Dakota to those big finance firms. The Bank of North Dakota is more profitable, 70% more, and has a better credit rating than JP Morgan Chase or Goldman Sachs. Next slide. So why is a state bank so profitable for the people? Well, they don't pay shareholders. There are no bonuses or fees or commissions or high-paid CEOs, no advertising. Also, a state bank could leverage 10 times their revenues on deposit. So at least 1%, so even at 1% interest, that would be a lot of profit. A state bank isn't a retail bank, maintaining costly locations or ATMs. It partners with existing local nonprofit community banks and credit unions and loans them the capital to loan to local businesses. So public banks have very low operating expenses, which something around 13% compared to commercial banks, which I think Ellen mentioned once, which are nearly 60% overhead cost. These savings are passed on to you, taxpayers and the borrowers. Public banks are more efficient, more rational, and effective banking institutions. And now I will hand it over to Madeline Chang. Madeline?
Cut them off.
Hi, I'm Madeline Chang. I was a labor and community organizer for many years and a New York City public school teacher for 30. And now launching Voices for a New Democracy. I'm part of that effort to launch that blog. So there are other examples, successful models for the US government using public money for the public good. One of them is the Reconstruction Finance Corps, called the RFC for short. This was a lending agency that President Roosevelt used to fund the New Deal and World War II. What's important about this, I should say it issued bonds and loaned and invested over 40 billion. What's important is instead of taking out high interest loans from private banks to pay private corporations to build something like roads, for example, which we tend to do today, the RFC cut out the middlemen. And it was the government that created the money to loan and invest. And it was the government that put people back to work, building, roads, bridges, post offices, about 3 million unemployed men and women. And the net profit to the government was over 690 million. So we have this precedent where the government became the biggest investor to the economy. It's like the economic power was essentially relocated from Wall Street to Washington, D.C. And we need Reconstruction again, just like in the Depression. We need to rebuild our economy, but we can actually do better than that by correcting past injustice. Black and brown communities have been hit by COVID, hit the hardest. And this is on top of all the inequality and disinvestment that private banks made worse over decades. And so public banking can help reverse the racial wealth gap by lending to Black and brown families, providing capital that historically has gone mostly to white families. The RFC this is an example of how we don't need to raise taxes. We don't need austerity, cuts to public transportation, cuts to education. We need public banking. So the next slide shows another successful model, postal banking, which we actually had from 1911 to 1967. We have 2 postal banking bills pending right now in Congress. The great thing about postal banking is the infrastructure is already there. We have 30,000 some post offices around the country. So postal banking is a perfect opportunity to serve the 25% of households that are unbanked or underbanked. People who can't afford to keep a balance or because there are no banks in the neighborhoods. And these households spend about $40,000 over a lifetime just on fees and up to 400% on payday loans. And Joe is going to talk about how this movement for public banking is growing next.
Okay, thanks, Madeline. And again, my name is Joe Sackman. I am from Nassau County. I ran for state assembly last year, and I'm also a member of Long Island Activists and NYPAN New York. So public banking is now a vibrant movement. For over 100 years, North Dakota has had a state bank, as we've learned. Now, California has passed legislation to allow for a public bank, and New Jersey's governor ran on creating a public bank. And New York, along with over a dozen other states, have introduced legislation to establish one, which is a big reason why we're here today. And that's thanks to forward-thinking leaders like Senator Sanders and Assemblymember Pichardo. I will tell myself next slide. All right, so why do we need a publicly owned bank? Having a public bank is going to give the state an advantage it doesn't currently have. For every dollar we have in a state bank, it allows us to lend 10. With the ability for the bank to borrow from the Fed at 0.25%, let that sink in, 0.25%, that means we're going to have access to inexpensive liquidity that during a crisis like COVID-19, we can use for emergency budget needs, like purchasing PPE, funding for schools, helping our small and local businesses to keep that local economy secure, and by being the banker's bank for community banks and credit unions. New York, like most states, works with private banks, and private banks answer to their shareholders, not the people. The people's money is best used when it's reinvested into communities. Why should the state spend millions or even billions in fees of interest when it could be using the money on schools, healthcare, and infrastructure? Also, the people's money should be in the hands of the people. A public bank would allow for local governance and control. You can read more about how New York will do that in the legislation that's being proposed by Senator Sanders and Picardo. When we keep our money, the people's money, in a public bank, we're not going into debt to private institutions. For example, infrastructure projects can cost twice as much as when they're financed through private banks. If we're going to build a wind farm on Long Island, taxpayers will be very happy when we save billions because we funded it through a public bank. Same goes for the many infrastructure projects planned throughout New York. According to a report by Action Center for Race Equality, New York State would have saved around $6.5 billion in interest payments alone if there was a public bank in 2019. I don't know about you, but this sounds very fiscally responsible to me. Those billions could be invested in our communities, or we can just keep giving it away to private banks at the cost of the taxpayer. And that slide sort of fit with that, so I'm just gonna fast forward. When a crisis hits like Superstorm Sandy or a pandemic like COVID-19, we don't have to wait for the federal government to decide whether it's going to send us help or if we're going to sue if it's just not enough. We also don't have to go begging private banks for loans, especially if they aren't willing to provide access to those loans. A public bank, like our friends in North Dakota have, can quickly have access to the funds we need to deal with the crisis. Like I mentioned earlier, quick, cheap liquidity, with the ability to lend out $10 for the one. We have the one that we have in the bank. So let's take care of its own financial needs. If I'm going too fast, let me know. A public bank could be the support our local economy needs. We've seen friends and families suffering during this crisis. Our local small businesses closing up, friends losing their jobs, families losing their homes and going hungry. Personally, I've seen many families in need. I was out there during the pandemic, helping with mutual aid, helping deliver food directly to the families, talking with food pantries and community organizations that were scrambling to find enough food to help the many people that were coming to them. If New York had a public bank during this pandemic, it could have lent out the money to support local food banks. We could have had the help local small businesses needed through supporting community banks and credit unions, like our friends in North Dakota did with their PPP to companies. Unemployment benefits could also have gone out faster to residents. And those two slides fit together. I kind of, sorry about that, I put it all there. So how do we do this? Today's public banks, an overview. Borrow interest-free from the Fed and lend at 1 to 2%. Direct credit where the community most needs it. Support local businesses and create jobs. Stimulate the local economy. Restore the depleted tax base and allow communities to declare their independence from Wall Street. So, well, sorry. So, as we can see, a public bank could do a lot of good here in New York. And so how do we start one? We can start one through an emergency executive order in response to the pandemic. According to banking experts, the basic mechanism for a public bank could be set up in a couple of months. And then the bank can borrow from the Fed, as I said before, at 0.25%, provide that 10 times the bank's capital for credit below market rates to distressed communities, which we have plenty of, and work with community banks to fund loans for small and medium-sized businesses. So this is very doable. We know it's being done. We've seen North Dakota do it. So this is something that New York could definitely do. So how do you get involved? Tell your elected officials. Call your governor, state representatives, and city council. Tell them to support the efforts to set up the public bank by emergency executive order, or join with it, or start a local grassroots public banking group. Connect with the Public Banking Institute, who's here today with us, and hold a public banking town hall, which we're doing right now. So we're already taking these actions. And that is that. You can find out more about public banking, the Public Banking Institute, just to give a little shout out. And Ellen Brown, who's on the town hall with us, has written several books, which you can also check out. I recommend them. And that is the presentation. Thank you. And I will hand it back to our host.
Well, thank you so much, Joe. That was very informative. And we are blessed to be joined by Eric Hardmeyer, who is president of the Bank of North Dakota. The Bank of North Dakota is the only public bank in the nation, and they've been helping local government, small businesses, and public transit, state infrastructure for decades. And thank you, President Hardmeyer, for joining us. And I turn it over to you, sir. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you. It's been fascinating to listen to the presenters. Let me just by background tell you a little bit about myself and a little bit more about the bank, and then I'll get into the specifics of the Bank of North Dakota. As was mentioned, the Bank of North Dakota has a history of 100 years. We were created as part of the progressive movement that swept at least the upper Midwest back in the 1900s, early 1900s. North Dakota was led by a very charismatic individual by the name of A.C. Townley, who gathered up groups of disgruntled farmers, was successful in creating a third political party in the state of North Dakota called the Nonpartisan League. They gained control of the legislature and then passed sweeping industrial resolutions that created not only the Bank of North Dakota, but it also created what is now known as the State Mill and Elevator, which is the largest single mill and elevator in the country. Along with that was what is now called workforce safety and insurance. So at the time, 100 years ago, you know, some of the discontent that I'm hearing in New York, it was similar to what we were experiencing in North Dakota. Deep disregard and skepticism of the big, large money center banks, the big elevators, out-of-state entities that really, you know, I felt at the time was controlling North Dakota's destiny. And so that really was the idea of this progressive movement, was for North Dakota to take control of its own destiny by creating its own ability to lend money and by the ability to market and add value to grain. And so here we are 100 years later. I have been personally at the bank for 35 years. I have been president of the bank for 21 years. When I came to the bank in 1985, it was about a $600 million bank. Today, we are about an $8 billion bank. We have set record profits for the last 16 years. 2020 was not as successful because of issues, as you all are aware of, but it was still the top 5 most successful year that we've had. Our mission, you know, 100 years ago remains as it is today, and that is to finance economic development throughout the state of North Dakota. So that's our primary mission. And with that, you know, we are giving a lot of latitude to creating programs and to work with the business community and the banking community to really hone in on how those are best met. So let me describe a little bit about how the bank works and some of our responses, how we think about economic development, how we go about doing it. And also let me just say at the very front end of this, I will not advocate publicly for this model, although I have spoken to at least 30 to 40 different states. I've been to numerous states talking about this. I find that this is a contentious issue wherever I go, the idea of a public bank, and I leave it up to the local jurisdictions to find out whether this is something that they are interested in going forward with or not. So I will not advocate, but I will educate. And for North Dakota, many of you know, is a red state with a very socialist institution the Bank of North Dakota and the Mill and Elevator. Would they be created today? Maybe unlikely, but I think that we have now become such a part of the state and such a part of the economic efforts that you would be hard pressed to do away with the bank. In my course of 35 years, I have seen a couple of attempts to stop the bank, to turn it back over to the private sector, but it largely doesn't go anywhere. Because I think as you know, you'll hear me describe, it is really ingrained as part of the state of North Dakota and our history. And the fact is, you know, it works. It works very well in our state. We have a unique model that may not be the same model that other states choose to implement if they go forward. But for BND, it works, and it works well. Our model really is, in addition to financing economic development, we also operate as what's called a banker's bank. And that is, we support the local banks. One of the stats that I saw earlier was we have more banks per capita than any other state. And I think largely that may be in case because of the Bank of North Dakota and our ability to help those businesses and those banks leverage the Bank of North Dakota and leverage our assets to go forward. So what is a banker bank? Basically, you know, just like individuals, banks need access to banking services as well. So we do normal things that a correspondent bank would do. We clear checks for our North Dakota banks. We do safekeeping. We do bond accounting. We do Fed funds clearing. We provide liquidity to banks. We provide them Fed funds lines. Earlier it was mentioned Fed funds are Fed sold by the Federal Reserve to banks. We do the very same thing for our North Dakota banks. We buy and sell their liquidity from them. And we have found that over the course of our history, we've grown very close to our North Dakota banks. And in fact, you know, they serve as our delivery channel. The Bank of North Dakota originates very few loans outside of a robust student loan division. Most of our lending is done in participation with a local bank. We believe that economic development is driven locally. Those banks certainly know their customers, know their businesses better than we do. And so what they do is they work with their customer, utilize the Bank of North Dakota's programs, of which we have many that they can choose from. We have programs to help entrepreneurs start up. We have programs for middle market, and we have, you know, programs for large, you know, Fortune 500 companies that are looking to come to North Dakota or to expand in North Dakota. So, you know, we do a little bit of lending in each area. We determine what those areas are by continuing to understand the economic landscape of the state of North Dakota. We visit with economic developers. We visit with bankers, with state officials to really understand what are the needs in North Dakota. How can we serve those needs? You know, one of the things I was asked to respond to was, you know, how did we do during COVID? What did the Bank of North, what was our role? And I would tell you, you know, similar to what we saw the firefighters do, you know, after 9/11, you know, that's how Bank of North Dakota thinks of itself is we rush in to where the disasters are to see where we can help. Most banks would take a very hands-off approach, a very conservative approach, kind of let the dust settle, figure out where they should play. B&D, on the other hand, because of the unique nature of what we do, that we are instrumental, I think, in the success of our economy. We are used to really getting in, rolling up our sleeves, finding out what the needs are, and then meeting those needs. Now that doesn't mean that we're not going to do our homework. In the case of COVID, we offered 3 different programs to small businesses outside of, the PPP program. We recognize, having dealt with financing disasters for, 30 to 40 years, that there is a role for the bank. But what we didn't want to do, and what we will not do, is duplicate efforts. If we understand that the federal government, the SBA, FEMA has a role to play in providing assistance to local businesses, we're not going to come in and duplicate that effort. Instead, we're going to see where the gaps arise and seek to fill those. So that is really our mantra is to be patient and to understand where the needs are so as to be as efficient as possible. I've been asked to talk a little bit about infrastructure. The Bank of North Dakota is a state agency on top of being, a state-owned bank. So I am the head of an agency, the Bank of North Dakota. I go to the legislature every 2 years when they meet. I present a budget that gets approved. And along with our programs that we develop on our own, we also have state-initiated programs that legislators may devise and ask for us to work on. Infrastructure has become a significant part of our growth of the state as we've gone through several energy boom and bust cycles, building out our infrastructure, whether it's roads, buildings, or water projects, flood diversion. B&D plays a role in administering, billions of dollars worth of programs to the state. We also act as the state agency's bank. So we will provide liquidity to other state agencies that need it. Our Department of Emergency Services knows that if they need quick access to money, overnight, we can get them money to meet their needs. There's a lot of different directions that I could go. I'd be interested really in answering questions that you may have. I know that there are some questions that I get in every one of these. And let me just answer a few of those off the bat, and then I'm happy to take questions. First of all, are we FDIC regulated? Are we insured by FDIC? The answer is no, we are not. We're not regulated by any OCC, FDIC, any entity at all. In fact, we are examined by the state Department of Financial Institutions, but they do not have any authority or exercise power to do any types of mitigation at the bank. How are we funded? Well, the Bank of North Dakota is unique and different from other states in that we have what's called a treasurer that is very weak in its duties that it has compared to other states. By law, all deposits collected by the state, all income tax, all fees, all sales tax is automatically deposited at the Bank of North Dakota. Those become our core deposits. That becomes the nucleus of our funding and how we have the ability to make loans to other entities. We also have access to the Federal Reserve. We are a member of the Federal Reserve. We are a member of the Federal Home Loan Bank. We have the authority to issue bonds if need be. But we have, at this point, sufficient liquidity and alternative funding sources to fund all of our needs. We also, because of our profits, we are able and willing to provide what's called a dividend back to the state. So every 2 years, we get into a discussion with the legislature on what might be an appropriate amount of our income or our dividends to transfer back to the state. Today, we are contemplating a 50% dividend philosophy, which means that 50% of our dividends could be transferred to the state. 50% of our profits, I should say, could be transferred to the state. The rest is built for capital growth. And today, the Bank of North Dakota enjoys a strong capital position of 12%. Our return on equity is upwards of 15%. It's been as high as 22%. And so with that, why don't I stop, answer a few questions, and we can see where it goes from there.
Wow, it's great to be talking to you, Eric Hardmeyer, our hero. And it was a great presentation. Thanks, everybody. So you said that if an agency needs liquidity, you provide it. What interest rate is that, and is that a loan, or what are the terms for that
Sure.
sort of loan?
Yeah. So it would be really what we use as an index for state agencies is we use the Fed rate. Today that's 1/4%, and we mark it up some to meet our overhead costs. So state agencies borrow at a rate from us somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.25% to 1.5%. I should say that not only do we provide a low interest rate to state agencies, but one of the other things that we do is we are and have been in the student loan business. We believe that education is a important part of the evolution of the state of North Dakota, the economic development of the state of North Dakota. And so we have provided student loans to our residents, since the early 60s. In fact, we were the first bank to make a federally insured student loan in the nation. And today, you've heard of SoFi. The Bank of North Dakota actually was the first to offer a total student loan refinance program. And today we lend money to student loan borrowers at a rate of 1.75%.
Wow.
Yeah, and so they have options of fixed or variable rate. So the nature of the bank, its low cost of money, is something that we do utilize to encourage economic activity, and we do provide that to our borrowers as well. We just simply take our cost, add something for overhead and profit, and get the money out as inexpensively as we can.
And where do you get the liquidity? Do you get it from the Fed? Do you get it from the Federal Home Loan Bank, or you just got it there in your deposit base?
Well, today, along with a lot of other banks across the country, banks today seem to be flush with deposits. But as I said, our nucleus of our deposit, our core deposits, come from state tax collections, income tax, sales tax, fees. But we do, as I said, have access to the Federal Home Loan Bank, the Federal Reserve. Our banks today are flush with liquidity, so they are selling us their excess liquidity. We have $1 billion of deposits from other banks on our books today.
Well, thank you so much, President Hardmeyer. I just wanted, as we're looking to pass the legislation in New York State to really enact public banks on the state municipal levels, I wanted to give the opportunity for the electeds that we have on the call to ask you some questions, since you know how to get it done. I have State Senator Jabari Brisport.
Eric, thank you so much, by the way. That's saying that you took the time to be with us over here in New York. But I guess I'm curious how, if any, interaction the Bank of North Dakota has with private banks that exist, what the competition is between you, and how you navigate that.
Yeah, that's the critical part of our success is, when you think about the bank and its 100-year history, I would say that, we were maybe one of the originators of the triple P model, the private-public partnership. So our whole model is built on partnering with banks, not competing with them. So the economic development loan programs that we have are all done in participation with a local bank. So the local banks originate the loan, service the loan, and sell a portion to us. And typically what we will do then is, we will reduce their risk into any one venture, allowing them to leverage that relationship, make more loans available. It allows that bank to operate at a size and capacity of the Bank of North Dakota. Some of them may have a legal lending limit of, $1 million, but because they are participating with us, they can access our full lending capacity, which on a bite-sized transaction would be in excess of 150 million. So we think of the banks as our partners, and they are our delivery channel of our programs and not our competitor. And I think if you look at, one of the 2 or 3 hallmarks of what has made BND successful, it is that model. It is the fact that we're not going to compete, for their customer. That's their customer. They have the relationship. They know them. We have no interest, no desire to have a direct relationship with that borrower, and think it would be counterproductive towards, the model. And, if we ever get backlash, it's because we may have entered into an area that does, compete with the private sector. A few years ago, we entered into the mortgage space. After 2008, 2009, there were underserved areas of the state where they just simply could not get a mortgage. So BND went to the legislature with the backing of our trade institutions and said, you know what, this is an area where the Bank of North Dakota can play. We can make mortgage services available in rural parts of the state that just simply don't have access to the market. So they now are able to get a home mortgage loan at the same rates of anybody else in any other community, using the Bank of North Dakota as the originator in that case. But we did it, with the full backing of the banking association. So it's a very mindful strategy to work with the banks and not compete against them.
I'm definitely thankful for all your experience in the matter. And I do have to hop off, but I really appreciated hearing from you and all the presenters. Thank you. This is very enlightening. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for joining us. We also have Assemblyman Victor Pichardo, who is chair of the New York State Committee on Banks. So he'll be a lead in really getting this forward. So I wanted to give the Assemblyman an opportunity to ask any questions that he may have.
Mr. Hardmeyer, really appreciate it. Actually, my question was very much in line with what Senator Brisport was asking, because a lot of the things that we're going to hear from folks who meet with us, either myself or the senator in his capacity, is the issue of pushback and sort of creating a new competitive model in this space. But I am interested in sort of using my own experience as a member of the legislature here in New York. And what we're seeing in our communities is that the traditional private banks are leaving, and they don't have a footprint in our communities anymore. For example, my district, who I represent about 125,000 people in the legislature. We have effectively maybe one bank in a 3-mile radius. So I know the Bank of North Dakota, do you sort of have that traditional banking model, having a footprint? People do their normal banking transactions with you, and is there a model either similar, either with that you know of or within North Dakota, that does that kind of stuff to sort of either create the space that maybe a credit union, for whatever reason, can't keep up with, or that the private sector has sort of just simply threw their hands up in the air and abandoned?
Well, yeah, so that's a really good question. So as we've thought about the bank, you've heard me describe our economic development efforts. But what we, really are not is the retail bank. And I think that's what you're talking about. So you can't come to the Bank of North Dakota, for example, for a car loan or a boat loan or, a personal loan of any kind, other than a student loan. So, we've set that aside and said, the private sector, for the most part, is handling that. We are just really interested in, what are the gaps that we can fill, and certainly, business startup is a huge area of interest for the state of North Dakota. We are, primarily an energy and ag state, and we go through the flows of commodity prices, and it's feast or famine in North Dakota. And so what we have recognized for literally decades is that we need to diversify North Dakota's economy. We need to have programs that help entrepreneurs start up businesses, because that's the lifeblood, and that's what I hear you talking about in New York as well. It is really the opportunity for entrepreneurs to get access to funding. And not only do we run, our own, loan programs, but we also have a venture capital arm where we have the ability to make, equity investments into businesses as well. And we're mindful that we're not investing into a company directly and turning around and lending to, a company that we bought an ownership interest in. So, it's an interesting model that we run. And I'm sure, as I've mentioned, every state, if they choose to go down this path, will have something unique for their state. What is it that you're trying to solve? If you start with that idea first, what are the problems? What are the gaps? What are you trying to solve, rather than trying to be everything for everybody? I think that gets you where you need to be. And the biggest pushback that I've always seen is the pushback from, the trade associations, from the banking communities are afraid of, unfair competition. And so, we've really structured the bank in a way to eliminate or diminish as much as possible that opportunity to compete with the private sector, but rather to help them meet their needs.
Thank you, Mr. Hardmeyer. I really appreciate it. I want to make sure that we have enough time and space for other either members or the general public to ask questions. So I'll leave it added to Maria. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, President Hardmeyer. That was very informative. I'm gonna turn it over to Bob Master, who is the Legislative and Political Director for Communication Workers of America, District 1. And Bob will be able to tell us why a public bank can really support unions and the labor movement and help the working men and women of the state.
Thank you very much, Senator Sanders, and thank you, Assemblyman Pichardo and Senator Bridgeport. I guess he's gone, but I want to thank him as well. And I also want to acknowledge that those were terrific presentations, a really compelling case that all of our presenters have made about the benefits of a public bank and what it could bring for the people of New York. I mean, the truth is, the reason that the labor movement should be for a public bank, and the reason that CWA, my union, the Communications Workers of America, and our 65,000 members in New York State are for a public bank is because of all of the benefits that folks have described here that will roll down to working people across this state. Starting with, for example, the idea that I think at some point somebody said our state would have saved $6.5 billion in fees if we had a public bank and we're using a public bank to process payroll and things like that. That's $6.5 billion that can go to our schools, to our payrolls, to our hospitals, which are all suffering. We have a gigantic budget deficit, and we are facing a real crisis in the state right now. That kind of economic, fiscal responsibility is what we need. Our children who need loans to go to college, to be able to get a loan at 1% or 1.5% as opposed to 6 or 7% or whatever the federal loan programs are talking about. It's a tremendous benefit for all of the working people. And so I would, I think that the speakers have made a very, very, a kind of an irresistible case, as far as I can tell, for the kind of unmitigated benefits of redirecting so much of our resources. Our state has, President Hardmeyer may be taken aback by this. Our state has a budget of $170 billion a year. It's a phenomenal amount of money. And those resources put to work differently as, loans for small businesses, as loans for our students and so on, can only benefit the working people of this state. I think it was very interesting at the beginning of his presentation where he talked about kind of the historical origins of the bank and the origins of the North Dakota Bank in an era of progressive ferment when there was a general uprising among working people and a populist demand to make the institutions of our government serve the public. That's what the labor movement is all about. The labor movement is about curtailing the uncontrolled power of corporations and big capital and trying to put more power in the hands of regular people. And this is, a very obvious and very important way of trying to do that. So we're wholeheartedly for a public bank. We think it's going to be a big fight. I think, I'm sure President Hardmeyer would acknowledge that you try to start a public bank 150 miles away from Wall Street, it's a bigger fight than if you're 2,500 miles away from Wall Street. So we have our work cut out for us, but we're in for the fight.
Well, thank you, Bob. That was very informative. We are also joined by Catherine Franco from the Buffalo Niagara Partnership. And Ms. Franco can talk a lot about how a public bank can really connect with the underserved and how many of these communities are really, they're not banked communities. So I will turn it over to Ms. Franco to give a discussion about how public banks can really help community economic development.
Yeah, so thank you for that. So I know that there are so many others on this call that really can speak to a lot of the work in terms of what public banking can do. I am no expert. What I will say is that I am really passionate, and one of the things that public banking really is a draw for me and some of the work that I do here in Buffalo is really in the way that we've been able to see grassroots organizations kind of come and do this work, really rally behind public banking, and the idea that we can take, particularly on the municipal level, that we can take taxpayer funds and take them out of big banks where they play with it on Wall Street, extract from our communities, particularly low to moderate income communities, particularly our Black and Brown communities, and that we can have that money and reinvest it right back into how we want to see that happen, that we can see equity when it comes to racial and economic justice. I think that that's really the big pull for me when I think about public banking and what it can do across New York State in cities and towns alike. So that's really huge. And I guess part of what the draw is for that is, when we think about what banks do, where the interests lie, folks have already talked here about banks are looking to benefit their shareholders and that sort of thing. When we have public banking and we're really having public funds for public good, we don't necessarily have to be thinking about issues around redlining that still happens to this day. So when we talk about, again, looking at racial and economic justice and trying to provide some equity, I also have to say that I would be remiss, I'm happy that I'm able to talk today, but I would be remiss if I didn't again talk about the groups that are doing this work. So Public Bank NYC, that we have a Public Bank Coalition in Rochester, that this is really kind of a statewide effort to get to get public banking in our municipalities. There's a statewide coalition equity agenda that is doing a lot of this work. So making sure that it's not just happening kind of on the policy level, but also really that we're getting people on the ground excited to understand what public banking can do for us, what community reinvestment looks like through the eyes of the residents in these cities, and how that can transform not just necessarily in infrastructure and parks, but really how we can make municipal funds, our taxpayer money, go further for us. And then I know that there's more time, and again, there's other people who can speak to this better. So I wanna give time over to those folks.
Well, thank you so much, Catherine. We are also joined by Dr. Wallace Ford, who is the associate professor at Medgar Evers College and a former head of the State of New York Mortgage Association, who can speak to this as well. So, Professor Ford.
Sure. Thank you very much, and good evening to all. And Mr. Hardmeyer, welcome to New York, kind of. And thank you very much for your presentation. Yeah, I just my thinking, and it really kind of follows up on what Ms. Franco was just mentioning, and it may sound like we planned this, but it's just that the issue is just so compelling. One of the concerns that, and again, when I was president of the State of New York Mortgage Agency, and also heading up New York State's Minority Business Program, and then New York City's Minority Business Program, has to do with the lack of access to capital, particularly in the Black community. And it is something that, and in working with Senator Sanders and his staff, we obviously tried to focus upon. It's not obviously not just the Black community, but historically and systemically, the Black community in any type of initiative winds up being in the lesser mode. My question for you, Mr. Hardmeyer, I know there's not a large Black community in North Dakota, but I would imagine the largest non-white community would be the indigenous people who live in North Dakota, and who are always living in what's now North Dakota. And the question that I would have is, are there any special, targeted, I don't want to say special, any targeted initiatives that the Bank of North Dakota has been able to develop to provide some focus there, because that might give us some guidance as to how a public bank here in New York State could perhaps follow best practices that you've adopted over these many years.
Well, thank you for that question. Yeah, over the years, we have developed programs that were, encouraging, our Native American reservations to take advantage of economic development programs. And really what we found is a opportunity of North Dakota businesses who are looking for labor. The reservations are, suffer a lot of problems with unemployment. There's health problems that you would have seen on many of the reservations around the country. All of those have plagued North Dakota as well. But where we have worked is to develop programs that encourage businesses to work 1v1 with the Native American populations to access employment opportunities. We have lent, many times to the tribes themselves for manufacturing facilities, manufacturing opportunities. And I would say that it's not so much a singular effort to work on the reservations, but more of a statewide attempt to bring us all up rather than just segments of our population. But again, we found that, it's economic development is all locally driven. We can put the programs out there, but there has to be local initiative. And that's what we've done. So we've worked separately trying to get liquidity onto the reservations. We have found that they still continue to be underbanked and underserved. and are willing to work with CDFIs or whatever the nature of that lending entity might be to provide our credit where we can do the most good. So to answer your question specifically, is there a targeted program to help minority and Native American populations? The simple answer has been there has been, but today it's more of a statewide effort to help the state as a whole.
Ms. Donovan, I just have a follow-up question, very brief one, which is in another life, I worked as an investment banker and worked actually with the Navajo Nation for a couple of years, which of course is one of the largest in the country. And its asset base is a lot larger than many that you might find in North Dakota. But what I was hearing you mention has to do with employment and consumer issues. But on the business development issues, is that something that you've been, obviously in some ways, the indigenous people would have to initiate that, but is there some way that you might be able to, the Bank of North Dakota might be able to encourage that? Again, I'm asking the question, not just with respect to North Dakota perspective, of course, but how, when we will have a public bank in New York sooner than later, how that bank could follow your best practices.
Well, yeah, it's a complicated issue. Lending on the reservation is, takes a little bit of a unique experience to do that. Many of them, of course, have their own sovereign immunity. What we've really asked for of the Native American community is to adopt, the commercial uniform code, so that lending practices can be done on a basis that are fair and equitable across. And so, that is one of the issues. I've been president of the Native American Task Force, part of the Banking Association, to really work hard to develop more liquidity, more programs on the reservations. And it really starts with, understanding the unique needs, getting, some adaptation of the Uniform Commercial Code so that banks can understand the lending methodology in which they're going to work on reservations. And that, I think, has been the largest single barrier to liquidity on the reservations, is really the adoption of the Uniform Commercial Code. And once that happens, I think capital goes to where there's a return, and you will see opportunities arise on reservations. I've dealt with it for 35 years, trying to work diligently to make that available. But it's not easy. I'll just freely admit that. More can be done. More should be done. And it's a problem that needs to be solved.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
I just want to commend Dr. Ford for his excellent question. We really look forward to working with you. This is the quality that we are putting together in this statewide initiative, from the grassroots up, from the academia. All of these efforts are coming together. There are many people who have worked on this. There's no one group that has taken this. This is many streams coming together, and we're working well together. And I will yield now and let True Blue New York. Who can argue with that title?
Thank you, Senator Sanders. I appreciate the time. I'm Judith Hertzberg, a grassroots activist and co-leader of True Blue New York, which is an organization committed to protecting the rights of all New Yorkers by working for the passage of laws and electing legislators that support progressive values. Enacting legislation to make public banking possible clearly supports that commitment. Municipal public banks in particular, and I realize we're talking about both municipal and state public banks, but municipal public banks are an excellent pathway to provide capital and funding in communities where such capital and investment is scarce, limited, and expensive. A public bank should and can be focused on economic development and investment in local communities, partnering with both local institutions and groups. Projects can and should, for example, be housing, building the supply of both rental and for-purchase residences, infrastructure, and funding for small and medium business development and growth. A municipal public bank's access to public fund deposits allows it to obtain funds to on-lend or invest at lower rates than commercial banks and other for-profit financial institutions. And I think that this is key in New York, where we are home to all the money center banks and many, many other kinds of for-profit financial institutions. A public bank won't be beholden to shareholders and have to worry about generating a dividend. It could be run at substantially lower costs than a corporate or retail bank or other for-profit financial institutions. So True Blue heartily endorses advancing this legislation, seeing a municipal and a state public bank come to fruition. A public bank's mission is one that True Blue New York heartily embraces. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Judith. I'm now going to turn it over to our co-host, Dr. Amara Inya, who is on the advisory board of the Public Bank Institute and has a lot of expertise in this field, and she will open the floor for open discussion. So, Doctor, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you for the wonderful questions that we've had so far, as well as just the really informative presentations that I'm sure will be educating people who tune in both to this call and watch the recording of this video. There are some questions that we definitely wanted to get to for folks who are on the call now, as well as a few questions that came in through Facebook. And so I wanted to just ask one of the questions that came in through Facebook, and then for those who have questions on the town hall who are in the call, you can either, if you know how to use the reactions, you can raise your hand or use one of the signals and I can recognize you, or we'll just open it up and those who have a question can jump in. We only have a few minutes left, so we'll try to get to as many as we can. One of the questions that's come in that I think is pertinent to this discussion is regarding unions and a public bank. And so I think this question would be for President Hardmeyer and as well as anyone else on the call. But the question is, could a union meet the banking needs of, could a union meet their banking needs with a public bank? For example, if they wanted to divest from a Wall Street bank. I guess a similar question was, does the Bank of North Dakota have access to the retirement funds of state unions? And so if you could speak to President Hardmeyer, those two questions, I think that'd be very helpful.
Well, sure. You know, of course, the way I started this is that what works for North Dakota may be different for other states. And so, you know, if there's a place for, you know, the unions in New York's state banking model, you know, I would say that's certainly a call that each state would make on its own. So, you know, we don't, although we have the only public banking model in the country, certainly I think what's going to come out of this are many different types of applications of this model. So what may be right for North Dakota may not be right for New York and vice versa. So, you know, I think that would be something that each state has to wrestle with on their own, what they want it to be. In terms of accessing, pension funds, no, we do not. We do not have readily access to the state pension funds, although the Bank of North Dakota has in years past administered certain parts of their fixed income portfolio where we've managed that for them. In one case, I will tell you that the state of North Dakota has put together what is called the Legacy Fund. And that is, today, the state of North Dakota receives 10% of all revenue, oil taxes that are collected come to the state of North Dakota. That is collected by the legacy fund. Today, that's about an $8 billion fund. When that started, all of those monies were deposited at the Bank of North Dakota. And so we quickly outstripped our ability to handle a deposit of that size. But most of those funds, the legacy funds, the state pension funds, are managed by, professionals outside of the state. And it is an area of, I guess, quite a bit of discussion in terms of, just as you've brought up, why are all those fees being paid to out-of-state, hedge funds, pension funds, professional managers, when North Dakotans could manage some of those funds just as well. So it is an area that we are discussing as a state today.
Thank you so much for that response. I want to ask if you can stay on for just a couple of more questions that we can take from the audience. I know we had Roger Meadows had a question, and then I had another question that came in that I think would be good for Walt McCree to take. But Roger Meadows, you had a question.
Yeah, I guess this is more for the senator. Under Section 266 of both the Assembly and Senate bill, I think the public is seriously underrepresented on the 11-panel member advisory board, where there's only 2 representing the public interest regarding social justice and consumer advocacy. Can we increment that by 3, making it 5, increasing the leverage of the public interest in the everyday decision-making process?
Well, I'm open to talk some more on it, and I encourage you to meet with me. We're very leery of changing a bill at this point. We've brought it this far. However, yours is a good point. So why don't we speak offline and let me get more information about what you're trying to do and see what we can do together. Yeah, I'm easy to get in touch with. I can give you my telephone number if you wish. Here's a New York City number, sir. 718-523-3069. I repeat, 718-523-3069. I look forward to your conversation.
Oh, thank you.
You're more than welcome.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Senator Sanders, for your responsiveness. That is definitely commendable. And Mr. Meadows, excellent question. There was another question that I think as we kind of wrap this up, to Walt McCree, there's a question about the relationship between a public bank, whether state or municipal, and local community banks. It comes up a lot in the town halls we do and in the conversations we have, where people are really wanting to understand what is the relationship between the public bank and the local banks. Is it synergistic? Is it competitive? So if, Walt, if you could speak to that question.
Well, Eric has been very clear about the way the Bank of North Dakota works and the whole ecosystem of giving credit with the public banks and working in support and collaboration with community banks. Because we're making up kind of new models of what public banks will look like, we think the BND model, it makes a lot of sense because local lenders are really important to the economic ecosphere of business. But because, as was indicated before, because small banks are going away, community banks are disappearing, we think the public bank in the space would be able to revive some of those businesses, that a public bank would be able to, as part of its portfolio, build lines of lending that it could share risk and move capital assets through the community banks. Which builds their business. I think one of the other stats that Eric referred to was that there are more community banks in North Dakota per capita than anywhere in the state. Well, they also happen to be more profitable on average than most of the community banks around the country, in part because of that synergy that is there. So, banking is an art, it's a profession, it's a business. We want it to be a utility for all the good reasons that have been spoken of before, but it's not a charity. You know, a lot of the issues that have been brought forward and that are all over the country, they're all the same: affordable housing, small business lending. I mean, the whole thing. The people are in need, as the farmers in North Dakota were, and the private capital markets are not serving us. So obviously, we need that new institutional framework to work for ourselves. So I think that what we're finding around the country is that municipal banks and state banks are going to be emerging on similar tracks, but we will be ones who support the collaboration between the business of banking and the public banks, so that existing network, what is left of it, can be revived and supported. We just think that's architecturally kind of a necessary way to go. Yeah, so that kind of answers that, I hope.
Can I jump in there, Walt? I think people are also asking what's the difference between the state public bank and the municipal public banks. So they want to know, is it okay? Like, why would you choose one over the other?
Well, not all municipalities are going to be able to have a bank, and you just have to have a certain amount of scale to be able to make the numbers work. States, of course, states really have enough deposit basis and resources. Cities, large cities, the ones like Philadelphia and San Francisco, who this week have presented new bills for public banks. But San Diego, Oakland, Los Angeles, Seattle, they're kind of all over the country have been involved in looking at municipal public banks. But we don't have a model for that in the country. So that's one of the things that's going to be emerging in our work together in building a new public banking horizon, a landscape. But scale is really important. I mean, a small community just probably can't have a bank. Now, what we've seen is that, for example, Pomona County in California Pomona is working with Los Angeles, looking at creating a regional sort of entity, joint power authority, perhaps. In Washington State, a bill discussed actually today in the Washington legislature, a bill to allow municipalities to combine their interest in infrastructure lending. So that bill approaches it in a little bit different way. You know, where the municipalities themselves, without banks, at least can sign up to be partners or stakeholders or equity holders in a state infrastructure bank. So, you know, we can make up a lot of variations of this. And I want to speak to another point here. Professor Ford was talking about the tribe investments, Native American investment. PBI is now starting to, we have a couple of our colleagues are working directly in that as well. And we're pretty excited that the Native Americans are, that certain tribal areas are able and have the resources and the business focus, which is what Eric also said, you know, you really have to have a regimen of business thinking to take the next steps toward building banks for themselves. Now, we think that there are other community targets. Black and brown banks also, you know, could use this matrix. But again, we're making this up, all of us, as we go along, and having collaboration with banking professionals. We think it's going to be really, really important. And as you heard me say, you know, we prioritize the importance of community banks. Eric, I did want to ask you a question. Here in New Jersey, the big pushback is that the State Banking Association, all the bankers said, we're against it. And we're going to lose our municipal deposits, even though we told them that it's not in the bill. But that is one thing. In North Dakota, despite the being flush with deposits, our municipal deposits shunted into local banks.
You know, Walt, that's a great question and a good point to make. You know, I was in New Jersey a couple of years ago and spoke to the New Jersey Bankers Association. You know, it was not well received by the banking association. They were polite and cordial, but I knew, you know, up front that I was in hostile territory. And it largely was around that particular area of municipal deposits. When the Bank of North Dakota was created 100 years ago, all municipal deposits and state deposits were legally required to be deposited at the bank. In the early 1930s, an initiated measure was passed that eliminated the requirement of political subdivisions to have to deposit their monies at the bank. And so, yeah, the New Jersey bankers were really upset about that particular issue. And I said, well, look, that's not how it works in North Dakota. We're not after the municipal deposits. We know that's a big source of income for community banks for deposits. We're just not simply going there. We have enough with the state deposits. So it was a point of great contention with the New Jersey Bankers Association.
Yeah, and I would just add that the writ in the law does not include the municipal deposits right off the top with it, because we don't want to alienate that. And I'm talking about the governor's office is saying we're not going to take your deposits that way. Yeah. I do want to just acknowledge A.C. Townley and the Nonpartisan League from 1913 and make a metaphor, an analogy to where we are all now. And that is that when they took over the government in North Dakota, and first of all did the mill and granary, the mill and elevator, the bank was kind of an afterthought, wasn't it? It was, but it became a legacy institution from which they built this very powerful environment. This is what each one of us, I think, on this call is doing, and a shout out to all of our partners in the local groups, the local public banking groups around the state, Rochester, Buffalo, New York City, and so forth, as we work on this together. This is a democracy rising moment, and that's really what A.C. Townley, I think, was speaking to as well. They actually started a group called the $6 Suckers, if I have that right. $6 was a lot of money, but these were people who put in a fair amount of chit to support that nonpartisan league fight around the state, and they did the circuit and so forth. Well, we're all at that point now. We all need each other to stand in all of our respective silos, to stand around the simple fact is that we all need money to get our public policies to work, to serve the issues and the needs that have been mentioned in this gathering tonight, and that we all see, whether it's affordable housing or small business lending. This is work that needs to be done. We can't count on our private capital brethren to do it for us. So we all need to stand together, and I'm just really excited to see so many of you, and we at PBI are here to help you any way we can.
Thank you so much, Walt. And I want to underscore the fact that this is a collaborative effort, that we're here to support these efforts in states across the country. And also what you've gotten from a lot of the comments is that we have the ability to actually craft this in a way that makes sense, that rises to the challenges of this moment. So while we have the privilege of being able to speak with President Hardmeyer in person about the experiences and his knowledge and expertise from North Dakota, and you have folks who are parts of coalitions from across the state. But one thing is that it really does become what we make it. And so we have the ability to really craft, whether it's at the state level, a public bank, or the municipal level, to really craft a system that meets the challenges of this moment, but also one that is aligned with the values of the kind of society that we want to build. And that is more evident now than it's been in the past. As we've seen with COVID, it has really simply unearthed or brought to light issues that are longstanding, inequities that are longstanding, communities that have been marginalized. It really has just exposed those in a way where we cannot ignore them. So I want to defer to Senator Sanders, as I know we have limited time, but I wanted to underscore what Walt is saying about the Public Banking Institute being just really in the trenches in this work and willing to support and assist these efforts throughout the state of New York and elsewhere around the country. That's what we are here to do. And obviously there are a lot of questions that we could not get to in this town hall, but that just means that there's a need for more spaces to have these conversations and to make sure that we get those questions answered. And of course, we're willing to help with that. So with that said, Senator Sanders.
Well, I want to thank you for being such a gracious co-host. and forget co-host, you really did it. And I'm grateful for that. In a moment, I'm going to let my co-chair have the last word. He is the new co-chair of banking. I will say that I want everybody to be involved, not just come out of your silo, join some other groups that are up here. Don't just stay in your group, get to another. You've got several. If I could encourage everybody to put their information in the chat so everybody can get in touch with everyone. I believe that this is being recorded. That means that someone at my office, Khadija, will be able to facilitate getting it to whoever we need to. But in order for this to win.
Can I speak to that just briefly? So this is being live streamed on Facebook. So you'll be able to check back on Facebook anytime. Go to our page, and I believe it's on the Senator's page. And also we will be uploading it to our YouTube channel after we've edited a little bit for brevity. So you can either get in touch with us or get in touch with the Senator's office.
They're fine. In the spirit of the unity that I was speaking of, we'll give you that task. We love it. So, my friends, in order for us to win, we're going to have to come out of our silos, and yet we're going to have to get to the grassroots. They won in North Dakota because they went to the grassroots. They got everyday people riled up, and they took back some of their democracy. We will have to do that to move forward. The groups that have done this work have done tremendous work, and they have brought it to this level. But to get to the next level, we're going to have to get everyday people on the block, or on the farm, or wherever we find them, to come together and say, you know what, we're gonna make this work, and it's going to be a multi-racial, multi-class initiative, like this phone call, like this Zoom today. You know, we've been speaking in each in our little silos, but to get to the next step, we must join hands and move forward. I'm very grateful to have worked with all of these folk. That if I start naming names, I'm already in trouble, because all of you are such fantastic people. And you really, what little I know of this, it's because you have educated me, and I appreciate that. I will stop. I want to thank my staff for doing a lot of the work to making sure that we are out here and hosting and all the rest of that good stuff. If I don't do that, I can't go home. So thank you very much for that. Now, my co-chair, my co-chair of the assembly actually is the chair of banking. Are you here, Mr. Chair?
Well, yes, I am, Mr. Chair. And again, thank you so very much to you and your staff, to President Hardmeyer, to everybody that's on this call who was able to make this happen. This was incredibly informative. I know that many folks who joined us through the live stream want to stay engaged, want to stay involved in this very important issue. Stay engaged with our offices, stay engaged with our staff. And again, I want to thank the staff both on the senator's side as well as my side for helping in organizing this event. But more importantly, we just want to emphasize, this is the first of many conversations that we need to have around this issue. And I know myself and many of my colleagues in the Assembly majority will continue to fight to make sure that all communities across the state have access to financial instruments that have been deprived by our communities. But also, more importantly, that we stay in touch, we stay involved, and we keep working until the job is done. And again, I'll leave it at that. And Senator, thank you so very much for your leadership on this issue as well.
You're more than welcome. I trust that everybody looks at that chat because it's filling up. People are really putting their information in. Make sure yours is in. Let's see. To the different groups that have done this, we have heard you. We in the state Senate and state assembly, we have heard you. Your silent cries are now very loud, and we're going to join with you. Continue to educate us. Continue, just as I'm going to meet that gentleman who was speaking. There's ways of making it better. You need to get to us and struggle with us so that we can make it the best that we can. Maria, is there any announcement or anything that we need to do before I give these people a benediction? Or not, or else I'm gonna pass a plate.
Let me turn her mic on, Senator. Hold on.
Well, maybe if I had a hat on, I would start passing it. Joseph Sackman would be the first to put money in, but that's all right.
Well, we just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. We hope that everyone found it informative, and we're looking forward to everyone partnering with us to get a public bank done for New York State and New York City. And over to you, Senator.
My friends, in order to win, we're going to have to hold hands. We're going to have to get away from your comfort zone, speak to people in North Dakota. I mean, come on. Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you all. You guys go and be safe and smile as well as Sister Anaya does, and we'll all do. If I had that smile, I'd be in the White House instead of the doghouse. Everybody take care. God bless you all. Bye-bye.